Thank you to everyone participating today in our highly anticipated presentation on how to break into the cannabis industry. For those that don't know me, my name is Tiffiny Fox. I'm an equity partner at Bassey, Edlin, Huie, and Blum. And my journey in the cannabis industry began a few years ago when our firm started a cannabis practice group. Now we have the ability to represent clients from seed to sale, which basically means from farmers to distributors. Now, despite the fact that cannabis is still legal on the federal level, it is one of the largest growing industries worldwide. So just to give everyone an idea, in 2021, the tax revenue generated by cannabis sales in California alone grossed more than $1.2 billion. And in 2022, US states combined reported more than $11 billion from legal adult use cannabis sales. So it's a huge industry. There's lots of work to be done. And we have a great panel today of wonderful attorneys who can speak to how they became an attorney or an advocate in the cannabis space and want to share some ideas about how you can too. So I'd like to kick it off with you, Blair. If you can introduce yourself and tell us a little about your practice and your journey into the cannabis space.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Blair. I am a partner at Rogoway Law Group, which is a firm that specializes in highly regulated industries, including the cannabis industry. My area of practice is regulatory compliance. So everything from helping people with licensing and permitting to enforcement actions, communications with government entities, those types of things. Prior to becoming a cannabis regulatory attorney, I was a criminal defense attorney, and the firm worked mostly or predominantly, I would say, on cannabis crimes. So clients that were charged with cannabis crimes when we were back in the collective model days. And so it was a great seamless transition into the regulatory compliance aspect once laws started changing in California and when licensing ultimately came online in 2018. So that's a little bit about me.
Thomas?
My name is Tomas Ortiz. I'm in the Los Angeles office at the Zuber Lawler. I have 25 years of experience as a litigator and transactional attorney focusing on commercial and real estate. I also have 20 plus years of bankruptcy experience representing commercial debtors and creditors, secured and unsecured, and lenders, both institutional and non-institutional in bankruptcy. I guess, interestingly, it's the bankruptcy side of the practice that led me to cannabis. I was brought into a couple of matters where we were representing or dealing with distressed cannabis operators and stakeholders and distressed cannabis companies. Using my bankruptcy experience to navigate clients through insolvency and distressed and a distressed environment where bankruptcy does not exist, a bankruptcy lawyer in a non-bankruptcy world, so to speak. That work has led to other types of work, both litigation and transactional. My current practice really focuses on non-bankruptcy, restructuring, receiverships and workouts, liquidation proceedings, and transactional work involving distressed assets and real estate. Also includes landlord-tenant issues, drafting and enforcement of leases, and I serve as outside counsel for a handful of cannabis companies. Also represent cannabis companies in what you would call run-of-the-mill litigation, commercial contract disputes, partnership disputes, and employment matters. Good to be here.
Thank you. Happy to have you. I'm Hilary. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice.
Sure. Yeah, I have a little bit of an untraditional path into cannabis law. I started working in the music business for a while in Los Angeles, actually, and toured and traveled with Live Nation for 10 years plus. So was in the business world prior to becoming an attorney. Ended up practicing corporate law in Los Angeles, and then music and entertainment law, and then moved over to Silicon Valley, and then subsequently to Sonoma to practice in cannabis. But largely a lot of the things I've been working on overlap and are the same. So transactional, corporate, everything from formation to exit of companies, through the life cycle of a company, whether it be, forming them, funding them, exit transactions, or things along the way like commercial agreements. So hopefully can be of help to you during this panel and answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And Raza?
Hey everyone, nice to see you all. Thanks for coming today. I'm also counsel at Zuber Lawler, based in downtown LA. We have about 40 attorneys spread around the country, and we have an extensive cannabis practice at the firm. And recently we've been branching out into more psychedelics related legal work. which, like cannabis, it's starting to be allowed under state law, but still has the federal conflict. I have a really sort of hybrid practice currently. I do a mix of regulatory, corporate, civil litigation, criminal cases, intellectual property, and I find it really exciting to be able to work in these different areas, adjusting to the quickly changing laws. And I think this is a great field for people who have a variety of interests and kind of don't want to get stuck in a rut and are interested in exploring kind of the gray areas and the conflicts in the laws, and also jumping into a new industry and helping sort out all of that are in place and solving problems. My start in the cannabis field before licensing came along, I spent several years traveling around to different state and federal courts all over California, also pro hoc vice and other states defending people in marijuana criminal cases. This was back when it was largely felonies for cannabis offenses. It used to be a felony to sell even 1 gram of cannabis or to grow one cannabis plant. So the stakes were a lot higher. You know, a lot of people were still getting sent to jail or prison for multiple years. And when the law changed in 2018, licensing came along. We started allowing adult use, and the felonies largely shifted to misdemeanors, at least in California. And my practice has shifted a lot more towards regulatory work, helping people get licenses and comply with the regulations, and also corporate work, setting up businesses, and then civil litigation as well, in terms of helping sort out disputes that happen in the cannabis industry, which turns out are very common. Thank you.
Well, I think what's really fascinating about what everyone said is that basically being a cannabis attorney is not just specifically related to the sales of cannabis, but there's so many different areas of law that touch upon this particular industry. So we've talked about the regulatory issues involved, the criminal nature, intellectual property, bankruptcy. And I think one of the biggest questions that people might have is when someone says, I'm an attorney in the cannabis industry, what does that mean? And I think one of the big stigmas, I know that at least that I've even faced, is that there's an assumption that working in the cannabis industry means that you are a cannabis consumer yourself, or that you're a cannabis enthusiast, and that's how you kind of got into, the industry. However, as we can see, there's a plethora of different legal avenues that can bring you into this space. Does anyone want to talk a little bit more about what the idea of being a cannabis attorney is for them?
Oh, yeah, Hilary, I think you're on mute, but I'm going to jump in here. So
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's, at least for me, as doing kind of regulatory compliance and government relations work, a lot of it comes from being able to speak with regulators, sometimes law enforcement as well. A part of my practice is assisting industry groups or, citizens in certain cities or counties with drafting proposed regulations or voter initiatives to kind of get cannabis permitting processes onboarded in local jurisdictions. So, there's a lot that goes into being a quote unquote cannabis attorney that you can learn whether you're coming right out of law school or you are practicing in another area that you don't necessarily work with cannabis companies, but a lot of skills that come from, adjacent fields are really applicable into the cannabis industry, because the cannabis industry now, as of 2018, when licenses became available in California, it's just like any other business, any other highly regulated business. So the skills that you would need, and I'm sure Hilary or Tomas will talk about this, or Raza, is that, doing corporate work or transactional work, intellectual property, like Tiffiny mentioned, litigation, real estate, banking, tax, all of those things are applicable to the cannabis industry as a business industry. So if you have those skills, you can generally kind of pivot your skills to be applicable to businesses operating in the cannabis industry. The thing that you have to be aware of is that there are, for example, if you represent businesses, restaurants, for example, just like restaurants, some of them have, ABC licenses for alcohol. A cannabis company is going to have state licenses and local permits for cannabis in California. So there's a lot of regulations that apply only to cannabis companies, but also general corporate and, operational tax, all those things are still going to apply to a cannabis company. So you can really transfer your skills from other areas, even if you have never ventured into the cannabis space.
I would say too, just, as relevant to what Blair is saying, Blair and I work together regularly. We're both partners at Rogoway Law Group, as we mentioned in the beginning, but we work together on almost every kind of transaction that you can imagine when it comes to even financings or a sale of a company that is a permitted and licensed cannabis business. Blair sort of with the lens of the regulatory and compliance view, and me with the lens of the corporate lens, really thinking about, how do we paper this? How do we write up this transaction and consider all the, potential pitfalls and liabilities and try to avoid those things. Also all while trying to make sure that we maintain the licensure and permits and don't run afoul of any of the cannabis regulations. So as a transactional lawyer, I have a pretty good baseline of a lot of the compliance regulations just by virtue of having worked closely with Blair through a lot of deals. And so, you really do end up learning a lot of overlap at different practice areas within the practice. And it is that much harder than a non-regulated industry because you have all the same business challenges of a non-regulated industry, but plus the layers of regulation, and it's a highly regulated industry. And beyond that, you have this multi-layered or bifurcation between state laws and local laws, and the fact that they're consistently changing. So you certainly have to keep up with the state of the law when you're practicing cannabis.
Now, some of the areas that we've already discussed today a little bit, corporate, transactional, regulatory, intellectual property, litigation, real estate, banking, tax, environmental law. Are there any other areas of law that any of you have practice in or would recommend to someone who's interested in getting into the cannabis space, but they might have a more niche practice right now?
Well, I'll jump in that I came in from like I mentioned earlier, from bankruptcy. And as most of us know, bankruptcy isn't available to most cannabis companies. And so it really, I was coming in with my bankruptcy experience and dealing with the world that doesn't have bankruptcy. And so working with restructurings and liquidations outside of the bankruptcy context could be incredibly interesting and exciting. And that layer of regulation also adds a certain level of complexity to these cases. But with regards to that kind of work, you've got alternatives, obviously, to bankruptcy, where you've got just regular workouts, assignments for the benefit of creditors, and you also have receiverships. And so being able to do that kind of work was also pretty exciting. The thing that we're finding early on with some of these workouts that we're doing, we're applying a lot of the bankruptcy concepts to these workouts. So if you've got, particularly if you've got, for example, you got a distressed company that's still operating or wants to continue operating, we borrow a lot from Chapter 11 bankruptcies, where you've got critical vendors and you've got those kinds of arrangements with certain folks and certain creditors, and to try to work out the distressed company work it through and ensure that the business stays in business. So that's been rather interesting as a bankruptcy lawyer, is to come in and kind of piece together what's there. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like as if we're going to get bankruptcy anytime soon, but we're certainly borrowing a lot from the bankruptcy structure.
So I think the key takeaway there is that even if you feel that you might have a job that's traditionally not forward facing in terms of the cannabis business, don't be dissuaded from attempting to, get a client that's in that space, or having those discussions at your law firm about working with particular clients that have a specific need, whether it's environmental, banking, tax, or bankruptcy, and then just really aligning yourself with entrepreneurs and other business owners in that space, and then bringing them in as a client in that respect, even though they're not, they might not be a dispensary or a form or a particular a particular business that is a traditional, what you might consider a traditional cannabis business. Now, in terms of non-traditional type of work that someone could get in the cannabis space if they wanted to, maybe they don't want to really work in maybe they don't have a background in the regulatory space or in intellectual property. What are some non-legal jobs, non-law firm jobs in the cannabis space that you guys have seen?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. So I would say, in California, we have kind of a dual licensing structure, right? So in cannabis, you have to have local authorization. Usually that's a local permit. And you also have to have a state license before you start operations. So right there, if you're more interested in kind of administrative law, or if you want to go into, working in a government job. So if you wanted to work for a city or a county as county counsel or a city attorney, or you wanted to go in and take your legal skills and work, in a planning department and help them write regulations or things like that, or on the state level, working with the Department of Cannabis Control, they are always posting on their social media or on the DCC's website about jobs that are available. So those positions, while there are, traditional legal jobs in those roles as well, like if you go county counsel route or you're an attorney at the Department of Cannabis Control, you can do those things, but you can also go more of the government route and be a director of a department, so director of licensing or those types of things. So you're using your legal skills, but not necessarily are you required to use your JD, or excuse me, your law license, your bar card to provide those types of services if you're not going the traditional like county counsel or city attorney route.
Yeah, I think, we see it a lot too. And I guess the question is non-law firm jobs. Some of us might think of firms as really the big firms that we know about. And then, of course, there are mid-size and small firms. I find that the larger firms sometimes have a cannabis practice within them. And then, as you get into the smaller firms, they tend to be a little bit more focused on cannabis. And then outside of that, you have obviously the licensees themselves. So you have opportunity for in-house counsel jobs where you're working for the business themselves. You're not working at a firm, but you're representing the legal interests of the licensee, helping them with, being compliant operationally, understanding best practices under the regulations, understanding, you wear multiple hats if you go in-house. You usually need to be able to kind of help that client with all kinds of issues that come up, whether they fall into transactional or litigation or, labor and employment or benefits or tax, at least be able to source the help you might need outside of that organization. So a lot of times you're in-house, but you're working with outside counsel as well. So that's another role that we see in the cannabis space that isn't a law firm role, but it is a lawyer role within cannabis businesses.
Now, because cannabis is still legal on the federal level, Raza, maybe you could tell us what are some unique ethical considerations for cannabis industry attorneys?
Yeah, this has been an issue for attorneys for a long time right now. There's a concern that because attorneys are helping clients in the cannabis space, that the attorneys themselves might be aiding and abetting federal law violations or involving themselves in a conspiracy to violate the Federal Controlled Substances Act. There are really stiff criminal penalties for doing that if you get caught up in that, as well as the state bar. You could potentially lose your license from engaging in unethical activities. So there's real concern, at least early on in the industry, that attorneys themselves could be charged with crimes, risk their bar license. It was a little bit unclear what you could and couldn't do in this field because of that state-federal conflict. And the conflict of laws, when there is a conflict, the U.S. Constitution, the Supremacy Clause says the federal law controls over any conflicting state law. So there's still, to this day, kind of in the background for attorneys and clients, the sort of threat that the federal government can come in and prosecute people at any time, start seizing assets, and the penalties can be really severe. Fortunately, there have been some guidance from state bars around the country. The California State Bar issued opinion a couple years back, clarifying that attorneys are allowed to work in this space, that it's not inherently problematic, but under the caveat that attorneys have to always advise clients that it is illegal under federal law, and also attorneys can't involve themselves in concealing federal law violations from government authorities. So I have seen attorneys get criminally charged sometimes, and a lot of times it's when the attorneys are doing something, helping the clients do something kind of sketchy to conceal some type of illegal conduct. But I think as long as attorneys are upfront from the beginning that there is this conflict, that there is this background risk of federal criminal prosecution, then the state bar in California and in various other states has concluded that lawyers are able to ethically work in this space. But it's always important to keep the criminal law issues in mind. I think it's important for every attorney in this space to have at least some basic familiarity with criminal law, because when it comes down to it, your clients are committing federal felonies every day, all the time. You're getting closely involved in that. There's some serious implications for anyone who gets accused of wrongdoing. And there's still all kinds of state criminal laws about this too. So whatever, even if you're doing more kind of corporate regulatory work, you always have to be kind of aware of these criminal laws in the background and be extra vigilant, I think, in this area, that you're following the ethical rules, just because the consequences of not following them are pretty severe here.
Yeah, and I would, just to kind of add to what Raza was saying, I think a lot of consideration goes into that from both if you're an attorney at a law firm that's bringing in clients, and if you're in-house at a cannabis company, right? So for example, if you are an attorney at a law firm, perhaps a good idea, and I'm assuming that most attorneys or law firms that bring on cannabis clients have something in their engagement letters that talks about, hey, this is still illegal under federal law. Like you are signing this engagement agreement, and you are, signing saying that you've read this and that you've been advised that what you are doing is a violation of federal law, and kind of restating what the California ethical rule is for that. California attorneys, we can advise you on how to comply with state law. We can advise you on how to do things properly, but we cannot, like Raza was saying, aid or abet you in the violation of federal law or any state laws, things like that. And just putting clients on notice that even though we are assisting them with, complying with regulations under California law, that no matter how compliant they are with California state law, they are still every single day that they operate violating federal law. And then if you're an in-house attorney, I think the considerations get even bigger, because essentially you are a part of the cannabis company at that point, right? So if you are aware, you go into a cannabis company, you're in-house, and you become aware that a lot of illegal things are happening at a cannabis company, I think it's something to take pause and evaluate your position as an attorney there, because you do have an ethical obligation not to advise on how to continue breaking laws. So, I would be very careful for people that go in-house about how you are advising clients, especially if you have reason to believe, or that state and or additional federal laws are being violated.
But that's a good point. California has a huge illicit cannabis market still. It's been kind of rocky getting the license market starting up. The illicit market is still very large, and a lot of cannabis businesses that have licenses are basically selling cannabis out the back door, unlicensed, untaxed, unregulated. And this is a lot of times going on at the same time, in the same business. And it's very important for attorneys. It could be tempting, I guess, to get involved in the backdoor side of the industry if that's what everyone wants to do, and that's where the financial incentives are pointing. But that's when you can get yourself in real problems. So far, the federal government has pretty much laid off of people who are strictly complying with state laws. Once you're doing the kind of unlicensed activity, then you're more likely to get federal scrutiny as well as state level scrutiny. And I think attorneys, especially in-house attorneys, but also outside law firm, just have to be extra careful not to get sucked into kind of this illicit market and helping people, conceal illegal conduct.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in, and I know Blair could. We have plenty of these interesting stories where we've had clients request that we assist them with things that we know are inappropriate. And part of that is just part of this sector in this field, right? Is understanding that it was a legacy market that wasn't regulated and has come up against some challenges being regulated, and it's multi-layered and people are frustrated by it. And so we do get a lot, and this isn't a far-fetched conversation we're having, because we do get a lot of clients who say, well, we know we need to report all the owners on our, for our license, but one of our owners has a criminal background and couldn't pass the background check. So we're just going to put his son on the cap table, and, can we do it this way or can we do it that way? And, the idea behind cannabis in these regulations, there are a lot of transparency requirements with respect to the state and local regs. And so when, it even comes down to when you are being asked to sort of fudge those things, and it falls squarely against the regulations, Blair and I explain why that's not the right path. And people do continually try to work around these regulations. Squarely violating the regulations is a problem. We try to get creative when it comes to transactions, and maybe there's some gray area there where the regs don't directly address something, and we might help, with transferability or a sale of a company, and go through multiple steps to make sure that we are being compliant with the regulations. But that's very different than aiding a specific violation. And I just wanted to kind of raise that, because these issues do actually come up in practice.
And
The other issue that comes up that I don't know it's been touched upon is corruption with local governments. The way California's set up the licensing system, local governments actually have a lot of control and power, how many licenses to give out, who to give the licenses to. There's a variety of different systems that local governments have set up. Some are more above board than others, but there's a lot of room for both corruption and incompetence at the local government level. And probably partly because cannabis is still largely a cash-based industry, with a federal law being what it is. A lot of people have difficulty getting bank accounts, so they deal in cash. And there's a lot of stories about government officials, getting bags of cash to give out licenses. And it kind of sets up these incentives when local governments, sometimes they'll say they'll only give out a limited number of licenses, and there's more people than that who are seeking to get the licenses. Then it just sort of sets it up. So it's sort of ripe for corruption, where the politicians are asking for donations. Sometimes they'll ask for donations to these shady charities and so forth. There's different ways of being corrupt, but it happens a lot, and it's important for attorneys to steer clear of that kind of activity.
Now, in a situation where an attorney becomes aware that their client is either participating in illicitly illegal activity, or they're trying to get the attorney to do something that they know would definitely get them in trouble, what would be your advice, Raza?
Well, you're not allowed to break the attorney-client privilege, so I don't think you should just start telling the authorities about that. But I think giving clear advice to the client of what the boundaries of the law are is important. Helping them flag any potential violations, helping them put in safeguards to avoid them. And certainly, I would say avoid participating. If you see something sketchy going on, don't put yourselves in the middle of it. Withdraw from that situation if you can. In some cases, you may need to withdraw altogether from representing a client if it's just so compromising that you feel like you can't advise them without involving yourselves in sketchy conduct. So but attorneys, a lot of times also clients are unsophisticated. They've worked in the kind of underground industry for so many years, and a lot of things are done on kind of handshake deals, kind of informally. A lot of times there's not a lot of detailed contracts or records, because it used to be that keeping records would incriminate you, and it could be used back under the collective days. If you kept records of your transactions, those could be used against you to say you were illegally making a profit. So a lot of people just wouldn't keep any financial records, and a lot of people were used to operating in this sort of totally unregulated underground market, and it's difficult for a lot of clients to transition to this new licensing regime, where a lot of people think that California's licensing regulations were way too complex, and they made it very difficult for sort of mom and pop businesses to navigate. Also, the tax levels were very high, and it created this incentive to sell it in the illicit market to avoid these really high taxes. So I think partly as an attorney, you have a role of educating your clients, and here's what the system is, here's what you need to do to comply with it, and they need some sort of hand holding. But if the client is kind of intentionally committing this fraudulent activity, violating state and local laws, you need to be clear that you're not going to be part of it, and if necessary, you have to be prepared to withdraw as counsel.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to also remember that, and it's because we're still kind of in the transition from the way things used to be done to now how businesses are operating under the new regulations from 2018 and beyond. Communicating with your clients, in writing, you can't really control, as just with any other industry, but I find particularly in this one, there's a lot of times that I will give advice and it's not within my control as to whether or not my clients listen to that, right? But as long as you are providing the opinion that is in furtherance of what the law says and what's allowed under the law, as long as you're not, a part of the company in another way, for at the beginning of kind of the legalization movement, I know of other attorneys that were, they'd represent a company, but they'd also own 19% of it, or they'd be kind of working with it as an owner. We don't do that at Rogoway Law Group, and we never suggest that other attorneys do, but just making sure that you're keeping like a very professional relationship with your client. And if there are things that you are concerned about, make a record of that in writing, that you are advising them against doing things that are illegal or, against what the regulations say. So that if there is an issue in the future, there's no question about how you advise that client and that they were aware that what they were doing is not legal.
And if I could add something really quickly, and that is, we don't want to scare lawyers off, because having worked in the food industry and real estate industry, there's a bunch of shady clients that want to cut corners in anything you do. So it's just a matter of keeping your antenna up, being aware of what the law is. And that's really the big thing for me has been, it's so highly regulated. You have to know the law. You have to know what you can or cannot do. And that's really half the battle. Once at that point, getting to know that, keeping up with it, you can guide your client through, and you can assist your client and try to counsel your client away from doing bad acts. But again, I think that happens in every industry.
I think if I'm hearing correctly, the main takeaway here is that, as an attorney, just like you would in any area of practice, your main goal is that you want to have an understanding of what your duties and responsibilities are, both professionally and ethically, so that you can properly advise your client and make sure that you're steering clear of any pitfalls that could potentially, expose you to getting in trouble yourself. And if anyone's interested in checking out the California State Bar formal opinion in regards to a lawyer's ethical duties and their ability to advise cannabis clients, it is formal opinion number 2020-202. So in speaking regarding other type of skills that some of the younger attorneys might benefit from learning about, that they should have or specifically try to hone in if they have an interest in working in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, I would say, look at to see like what cannabis companies are doing on regularly. So for example, I think all of us on this panel have touched on knowing what the regulations are is key, because, there are so many nuanced things like Hilary was kind of talking about earlier. When you're papering the formation of a company, or, a cannabis company that you represent does very well and they want to bring on an investor who wants to own 30% of the company, in general corporate practice in a non-highly regulated industry, that's, I'm not downplaying the document creation process, that it takes a lot of time and it can be very detailed, but it's usually a pretty straightforward process on how you bring in an investor and how you negotiate those agreements. But in the cannabis industry, there are both local and state regulations that restrict how owners can come in, what qualifications an owner has to have in terms of criminal history and, other things that may be going on in their personal life. So really, I always suggest when I have junior attorneys that I work with, or if I'm mentoring anybody, go on the Department of Cannabis Control website as just, a basic first place, look at what the current regulations are, maybe download a copy. I'm old school. I have a printed copy that's bound, but it's like 400 pages, and just start combing through it and getting an idea of what they say. It's not necessarily the most entertaining read you're going to have, but when you kind of start combing through, you can see what the various issues, what the regulations these businesses have to comply with, just from, the start of applying for a license, what kind of things do they need to put together? And that will kind of start to shape how you think about the cannabis industry. And then on top of that, once you look at the DCC regulations and look at the DCC website, they have a lot of good resources for people that are just trying to learn about the regulations. But also remember that there's a whole kind of like what Raza and Tomas were talking about, local regulations. Each city and county in the state of California has its own cannabis rules and regulations. Some cities and counties have completely banned cannabis business. Others allow the full gamut from, nursery, cultivation, all the way through retail sales and distribution. And some only allow certain types of cannabis business. And not all the time do the local regs and the state regs match up. Sometimes there are conflicts or different rules about how you can change ownership and what the reporting requirements are. So just, from the regulatory side, get your feet wet with the regulations, because that's going to seep into every other area, whether that be, negotiating contracts, writing contracts, mergers and acquisitions, all of those things are going to be impacted. So I would say that's a good place to start.
If I could piggyback on this, and that is, it's new. This is relatively new law. So as a young lawyer, you can really create an advantage if you understand the regulations, because that's key. You're always going to be in a room with other lawyers that know about contracts and know how to put together things. And, coming from the real estate and bankruptcy sector, where the laws have been there since the dawn of man, it was really exciting to have these laws that were just brand new, that people were really just learning about. If you're a young lawyer coming into it, take advantage of that, because you can really use that to your advantage in the context of, like I said, being the person in the room that knows what they're talking about when it comes to regulation, because it impacts every aspect, whether it's in litigation, whether it's in when you're putting together a deal, whatever sector, it's critical. So take advantage of that.
And I would just say, in addition to the written regulations, there's also just sort of the practice of how this plays out at the local government level. And, a lot of things happen at city council meetings, sometimes neighborhood councils are involved, and just, it's not always apparent from the website. Sometimes you have to kind of insert yourself into these local government processes. So just getting a kind of familiarity of how the local government actually works in practice, who are the key players, how do these kind of meetings actually play out, just the practical nuts and bolts of how it works at the local level, because so much of it is driven by the getting that local license. And then a lot of times, once you have the local license, the state license, it's kind of a matter of jumping through some hoops. But the real kind of difficulty a lot of times is dealing with the local agencies and complying with them.
Yeah, and I think along with that too, understanding the implications around it politically and environmentally, and going to those meetings can really give you some good insight as to what the councils are facing from the communities, because as you can imagine, there are mixed feelings about issuing cannabis permits and licenses in certain localities and communities. And so you start to get a real understanding of the policy objectives behind the issuance or non-issuance of permits, and that oftentimes plays out in the regulations that you're studying. So I think, yeah, looking at the regulations, understanding the regs, I would like to take it even just a step up if you really want to give yourself some edges. You know, if I read the regulations in a vacuum, I sort of understand it, but I don't have necessarily a really good understanding of which ones matter more or less and when they're going to get applied. And if I am, you know, I have some background and understanding about how businesses work, I might understand, oh, wow, this part of the regs is probably a bigger deal than this other part of the regs. And I say that meaning try to do a little bit of background research and understanding on business law. Like I would recommend understanding how businesses are put together and how they work. Like, you know, going to nvca.org, understanding how they get financed, understanding how they might change ownership and governance over time. And part of those things, that basic corporate understanding alongside the regulations will help you look at the regulations with a different lens and comb to say, well, do these make sense even? Because I find that, you know, what Blair and I work on a lot of the time is we look at regulations and we've had to try to suggest several language changes because you don't always have the regulators sitting around the table that have a business understanding. And sometimes they're written in a way that either doesn't answer the question or isn't practical for how businesses work. And that's also just, you know, a product of late regulation and consistently changing regulations and emergency regs and so forth. But I think having a combined understanding, general understanding of how businesses operate, plus looking at the regs with that in mind will be helpful for you to zoom in on some of the more important takeaways from the regulations.
Yeah, and I think if you're a new attorney or you're, you know, just coming out of law school or you're in law school and you're thinking, hey, I'm interested in entering the cannabis law space, what classes should I take? Or if you're looking for CLEs, those types of things to take. Every cannabis business is going to need transactional documents, contracts. They're going to need somebody that knows how to negotiate. They're going to need, you know, business, you know, documents drafted, all of those types of things. So if you're looking for something that can easily translate over into the cannabis industry, and given the fact that all the regulations are very new, so, you know, when people say, oh, I've, you know, been a cannabis attorney for 30 years, sometimes I look at people like, here, because it's that there wasn't like a cannabis business practice that people were doing for the last 30 years. You know, people have transitioned from other areas into the cannabis field.
Not a legal one, not a legal one.
Yeah. So I would say, you know, if you're just looking at like what technical skills to hone, I would say, you know, working on transactional documents, knowing how to draft good contracts, knowing, you know, your indemnification requirements or, you know, those type of general things is always going to be helpful. Now, granted, there are going to be more senior attorneys that have way more experience doing that. But if you can develop that skill wherever you end up, and kind of carry it over once you have regulation knowledge, I think that that's a really good place to start. And that allows you to kind of move into different avenues in the industry, and kind of build your resume in a good way.
Hey, Blair, sorry, just real quick, I saw a Q&A that I think would make sense for maybe Blair to address in this context. As someone was asking, what's the best resource for keeping up to date with the regulations since they change so often? Mm-hmm. I just thought we might just fill that in here since it's so relevant to what we're talking about, suggesting they keep up with things.
So the Department of Cannabis Control website is great. They also have like a tab that's current regulations. They have the statute, which is Mount Cursa. And then they also have a rulemaking tab that shows what, you know, is going through the rulemaking process right now. Regulations are always changing in this industry. There's always, you know, a new Senate bill that's coming through. So keeping an eye on those things. On the local level, it is a little bit more difficult. Like Raza was saying, you know, the local regulations, and especially in smaller cities or smaller counties that don't have, you know, great websites that are being updated constantly, there may be new rules and regs and ordinance amendments that are coming on the books there that not only are not talked about on their website, but also there are a lot of, you know, even in the bigger cities and counties, rules that come about or internal processes that nobody ever publishes or talks about, and you don't know about those things unless you call somebody in the planning department and talk about it. And it's this, not that it's a secret, but there would be no way, there's nowhere for you to find those things. So like Raza was saying, on the local level, even in the bigger cities and counties, you're going to need to kind of either march yourself into, the planning office, or if there's, a Department of Cannabis regulation or Department of Cannabis control office on the local level, going in there, learning who the players are, scheduling meetings, just to talk about what the changing rules or regulations are. Because, even we've seen in some of the bigger jurisdictions, things are constantly changing. They're constantly getting feedback from stakeholders and community members. And if you are, just diving into this, and say, for example, you go on to, I'm just going to throw out, city of Los Angeles, because, that's where a lot of us are. If you go onto that website and you're clicking on a link that is regulations from 2018, and you're thinking that that's current, you're probably wrong. And they have done a good job of kind of updating their rules and regulations online. But even there are some things that, the rules and regulations don't cover every possible scenario. So there are going to be times when you have to reach out directly, likely anonymously. You're not going to all the time like name your client, but talking about specific issues that you have questions about, to find out what they're going to say in response. And there may not be a code section that you can go to get the answers all the time. And that's one of the cool things about the cannabis industry, but also one of the things to know that it can be quite frustrating at times, because you may have questions that the rules or the regulations don't answer, and then getting someone to answer those questions for you can be difficult at times. So, learning how to communicate with government officials, learning how to put in requests and be politely consistent, trying to get answers, and learning kind of the politics side of dealing with local and state government officials is also something that would be very important for a new attorney coming in.
And I would just say, don't be shy to give them a call, or, stop into the office. A lot of times they're very friendly and are happy to kind of help walk people through these things. And there's things that you can't really see by just reading the regulations. You want to see actually how it works in practice, and the people who are working in the government agencies can be the key a lot of times in terms of developing a good relationship with them and just bouncing ideas off of them. And they can a lot of times point you in the right direction.
Yeah. And know that the person, if you're just calling, the front desk or the planning department, the person that answers the phone that may say, oh, what's your question? Maybe I can answer it for you, are always super nice and very well-meaning. But if you as an attorney are asking a question, usually it's because it's not answered directly in the regulations. So even when you call the DCC on the state level, sometimes you'll call or send an email and I'll say, hey, I have a question about X. I realize that it's addressed in section, 15420 of the regulations, but it doesn't specifically answer this question. Can you give me feedback on that? A lot of the time, the email response that you're going to get is going to say, well, as you see in section 15420, this is what the regs say. And so you're not necessarily going to get very detailed answers just by sending one general email to the, Department of Cannabis Control main email address. Sometimes you're going to have to dig in and find, a specific person to talk to. So just know that it can be a challenge to get responses to non-obvious regulatory questions in a timely fashion. And sometimes you just have to keep following up.
So that
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
To that point, like sometimes we get different answers, and it just depends on who you're talking to, because it is an evolving area of law. And the types of questions that we're likely to ask are those that are not clear on the face of the regulation. And so we oftentimes will not get an answer because perhaps there isn't one, or they haven't thought of that scenario around the way the code has been drafted. And, Blair and I have struggled with that at different times. I think as an attorney, you have to think about, well, what's the big picture? Let's also think about the policies behind what's there in the existing law, on the face of the law. What are they trying to prevent? Are we, technically not violating the law, but we're pushing the envelope on something that clearly the regulators or, that they anticipated trying to prevent, such as, transferring a license or something like that. So I think that, you really want to think a little outside the box when you're reading these regulations, because there are some parts of the regulations, and Blair, you could probably elaborate more on this, but I think just the takeaway is that there are some parts of the regulations that leave a lot of discretion to the regulators to interpret and bring them further than what we see in the mere writing of the regs.
So, and kind of talking about, people who really want to break into this industry and, get their feet wet and want to try to hone their practice in the cannabis space. What are some good networking opportunities that people that you're aware of, are good organizations that you would join? I know I'm a member of NCIA, which is the National Cannabis Industry Association. It's the oldest and largest trade association representing legal cannabis businesses. They have events nationwide all throughout the year. They have a great lobbying event in DC where participants who can actually, lobby directly and talk directly with the lawmakers in DC about what's going on in the cannabis industry and voice their opinions, which I think is, really amazing, and an event that I'm planning on attending this year. There's also allevents.in has all the local Los Angeles cannabis events that are occurring locally here in the Los Angeles area. And then I know that the Beverly Hills Bar Association Cannabis Law section is going to be having a mixer on April 13th. Does anyone else have any suggestions about other opportunities or events or associations that people can get involved with as they continue to grow their cannabis practice?
Yeah, so there's also, obviously look to, if you're not, in the Beverly Hills area, look to your local bar association. A lot of bar associations have cannabis sections. Los Angeles County Bar Association has a cannabis section. Also the International Cannabis Bar Association, that's the INCBA. They put on a lot of great social events, networking events, a lot of online material as well. But also look to any of, there are some like local cannabis business associations. So not necessarily bar associations, but like actual associations with operators in the cannabis space. I find that you can learn a lot about kind of the issues that local operators are facing and what kind of the needs that they have. And if you're looking to network with the opportunity to build your client base, sometimes going to those events, getting to know the operators is very helpful. A lot of the times they're going to be already represented by counsel, but perhaps there are, things that are outside their counsel's expertise that you do. So for example, if you have knowledge about environmental law, or you have a background of environmental law, a lot of, or all cannabis businesses have to go through environmental processes, some more stringently than others, for example, cultivators. So you could, make avenues that way and helping people with those things. So get involved in those groups, look those up, and kind of look into your local bar association, I would say.
Yeah, I would say talking with the operators is important. Just getting some personal experience of people within the industry and how it actually works. It is kind of an unusual industry given the history and the long underground market and the federal state conflict, and there's just sort of all these unique issues that aren't going to be readily apparent. But if you can go to industry events, just walk around, talk people, ask them about questions about what the problems they're dealing with, and just kind of get a sense of what the real issues, the practical issues that come up, and then as an attorney, you can help them figure out how to solve those problems.
In California, you'll see conferences too. I know we I don't know if we really touched on some of the bigger conferences, but you have Hall of Flowers and then you have MJ BizCon is in Vegas, but I think that's one of the better conferences I've attended. Hey, you have an excuse to go out to Vegas and maybe have a little fun and see some shows while you also go to the expo and try to meet folks. I found that one particularly brings in a wider range of investors and participants. I spoke there last year and I went the year before, and I just think that is one of the better cannabis conferences in terms of the demographic that shows up to these. And I think it just also gives you an idea, an exposure to like what that industry is like and whether it's something you really want to, be deeply involved in. You get to understand the culture, the people, the B2B experience, the business to business experience at those events. And then also see, sometimes you'll get to meet some of the investors wandering around, and just by virtue of meeting folks over time, you start to cross paths again. And that's where you establish, I think, relationships in the cannabis industry. I think in Northern California, when I was living in Sonoma, almost every day, just going out to a restaurant or going out to a bar or whatever, wherever I was, I would run into somebody that is industry touching in cannabis, because Northern California and Southern California both have, such presence in the cannabis industry. So, just continuing to follow some of those threads and keep in touch with those folks.
Yeah, and I think something super basic and something I think, Tiffiny, that you touched on in the beginning is not every attorney that works in the cannabis industry consumes cannabis or, is involved in the cannabis industry in that way. However, if you're going to be a cannabis attorney or an attorney that provides services to cannabis business operators, understanding like basic tenets about cannabis, about the cultivation process, about the products is pretty important. They want somebody who speaks at least a little bit of their language from an actual operations and product standpoint. So if you're wanting to get into this industry, I highly suggest, find a licensed dispensary, and you don't need to buy anything, but go in, look at the process of how do they let you in? How do they card you? How do they, when you go in, what kind of products are on the shelves? Look at the packaging, look at the labeling. As a compliance attorney, I have gone into many dispensaries, and just looking at packaging and labeling for me was, eye-opening, especially in the beginning, because I saw so many packages that were inappropriately labeled or missing things. And not that I went up and told anybody about them, but that's how I got to realize, an important part of the practice might be offering a service where I review packaging and labeling mock-ups and, provide feedback on, you need to have this, or this is too small, or, those types of things to add value to the client's business. And so just being, you don't have to consume cannabis to be in the industry, but you should have a basic level of knowledge about cannabis, especially if you're offering regulatory compliance help.
Now we're getting close to our time. So I did want to take a question that I thought was pretty interesting from the audience. With the current state of the legal cannabis market, what do you see for the future of cannabis lawyers? I mean, personally, I don't think this is an industry that's going away. I know that the markets have seen a bit of a downturn in recent years, but I definitely think that we're going to continue to see this space grow. I think that the Federal Banking Act will eventually get passed, and I also think that eventually it will be legal on a federal level, and I don't see it contracting to a scale where people should be thwarted from entering this area. I don't know, does anyone else have any takeaways?
Yeah, if I could add just a little bit. I mean, I think it's like any lawyers in any sort of industry. I think that when the industry is expanding, you're going to have a lot of certain types of lawyers. So transactional lawyers, merger and acquisition lawyers, those folks. When the industry goes into a bit of a downturn, or there's problems with it, and there's an argument that maybe we're going through that zone now, litigation counsel, restructuring counsel that deal with stress. So there's always going to be an equilibrium with regards to the industry is always going to need lawyers, and it's just a matter of what kind of lawyers are going to be the ones that are the most popular, and that's really where the ebbs and flows of an industry will dictate.
Yeah, and I think having diversified skills, that's kind of where it becomes important. Sorry, Hilary, for jumping on you. But I think that's why having more than one thing that you do is kind of important, or, when there are dips in the industry, making sure that you can, provide the services, regulatory compliance, for example, isn't just something that the cannabis industry faces. I think Raza was talking about the psychedelics industry at one point, or, there are the wine industry, there are all sorts of different industries that have, need help with regulatory compliance or need help with contracting or those types of things. So you don't have to get stuck just assisting clients in the cannabis industry. But even if you do, just your practices directly towards cannabis businesses only, if you have skills that, businesses will always need. For example, businesses are always going to need help writing contracts, especially, you know, right now there's a lot of litigation in the cannabis industry. A lot of those things deal with, you know, owner disputes or contract disputes, those types of things. So being able to insert yourself in kind of different areas of the law based on the knowledge that you have is pretty key, especially when you're in a new industry like cannabis and one that has been volatile for a little while. Just making sure that you have diversified skills that you can apply in different avenues.
And I think just thinking about what's going to happen when the federal law changes is key too. I think that's going to open up a lot of opportunities for attorneys, because all of a sudden you're going to have a national market, and all of these businesses that have been segregated within individual states can do businesses with each other. It's going to just open up all kinds of mergers and acquisitions and new new business opportunities. Also at the international level, you're starting to see more countries legalize cannabis, and there's more opportunities for cross-border transactions. So, part of this depends on how the federal law is going to change. I know Biden has proposed moving cannabis to Schedule 2, which would be a little bit odd. It would basically put it only into the medical side, and you could only sell cannabis as an FDA-approved drug through a prescription. That would certainly change the industry dramatically if that happened. Some people think that they're just going to deschedule cannabis at the federal level, and that would leave it largely to the states to regulate. But paying attention to kind of the next phase of cannabis and what opportunities that'll open up, and helping clients, prepare for the legal changes, I think is also key here.
I agree with Tiffany that it's not going away. I mean, this is a product that is too popular. The trains left the station. Most of the states are legalizing. People love cannabis. And so it's going to be around, and there are going to be legal issues. And I tend to agree that right now litigation is taking some of the weight. What we saw is really unique, I think, in this time period in California. We saw, not only do we see an unprecedented pandemic, which actually, I think we saw some product purchase initially going up because, people had anxiety and they were at home and they were in lockdown and they were maybe not going to as many bars. And then we saw sort of a race to the bottom for cultivation, just too much product, everybody undercutting each other on price, and then very high taxation. And so we have seen an extinction event across California that I think is a very unique, perfect storm. I think that we will weather that storm, and in what way we come out on the other side is unclear. Tax situations really need to change. I think that's a big one. But I tend to agree that understanding both sides of a practice, whether it be dispute related or transactional related, is a great way to sort of protect yourself through the ebbs and flows of this volatile regulated industry. Even now, and I'm doing transactional law, I'm now focusing some of my transactional law on preventing litigation, on risk mitigation, on making sure you're following your corporate formalities, on labor and employment issues, because we're seeing that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing in a distressed environment. So there always will be work. It's just you have to be prepared to pivot at the right time.
And I think that leads us to a great segue. Thank you guys, to say thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you so much for all of our panelists. I'm here at BHBA. We appreciate everyone's attendance and participating. Again, the cannabis law section is going to be having an event on April 13th. Blair, do you recall the location?
I think we're still getting finalization on that, but it will likely be at one of the consumption lounges in Los Angeles. So it'll be a fun situation.
So everyone, please look out for that invitation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathleen.
Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.